My name is Rachel Jackson. I am a member of the teaching team. I have been coming to Faith Community for 18 years. I always know this because my youngest is 18, and we started coming when he was born. I have done all sorts of things here, led faith groups. I've been on the elder board, and now I'm a teaching team member. I have two boys. One is almost 20, and he literally landed at 10:51 back in Atlanta to start his sophomore year in college. And I have a rising senior in high school. So that's who I am. And today I have the privilege of bringing you a message as part of our parenting series, Raising Extraordinary Kids. When they released the title to the members of the teaching team, I was like, no pressure. What a name. Wow. But that's what it is. So that's where we are. When the team gets together at the beginning of every series, we get together to make sure that we sort of put together a series that makes sense. You know, we don't duplicate each other. We like to plan out the series. So when Angie, Dorian, Mike, and I got into Mike's office, and Mike started the meeting with, "So are you all excited to teach on parenting?" The other three of us went, "Sure." Because if you had asked me to teach on parenting, like when my kids were 4 and 2, I would have probably been more excited. Because at that point, things were still going great. I had a lot of control, right? When the kids are little, you have a lot of control and routines. But as Mike said in his May message, I don't know if you've heard it, he had a May message, and maybe Dorian spoke it here. I don't know who was teaching where, when. But there was a message on 3 essentials for building a family, right? And he talked about that moment when our kids start learning to say no and learning that they can walk away. And as soon as they start learning to say no and discovering that they can walk away, the parenting game changes forever, and parenting becomes much more harrowing. That's okay, thank you. I'm going to put the iPad over. Well, I don't want to drop the iPad. Let's do it this way. Okay. The parenting game changes forever. So 2 weeks ago, Mike spoke on what it means to be a role model worth following for our kids. And last week, Angie spoke on passing on our faith to the next generation. And today I'm teaching on establishing reasonable and fair expectations for our children. And so you may be asking, why do we set expectations for our children, and why is Rachel Jackson the one teaching on this? You see, when Pastor Mike in Hopkinton a couple weeks ago, he announced that I would be speaking on this topic, and I happened to be sitting next to my almost 20-year-old, and I sat there thinking, well, this is awkward. And my 18-year-old recently told me within the last week or two, he said, so I'm filling out a questionnaire, Mom, for the teacher who's writing one of my letters of recommendation for college, and I have chosen to skip the optional question on parental expectations because I've decided, and I quote, not to throw you under the bus. See, I'm the mom that other moms used to send tiger emojis to, accompanied with the word, wow. So I've been through some things with my kids, and I have learned some things the hard way, and I would love it if you don't have to. So, how about we pray and then jump into the message? Holy Father, I just thank you that you are a good shepherd and that you gently lead those of us who have young. And some of us are great in this area, and some of us have some things to learn, maybe feel like we're messing up. I just ask that you meet us with a message of challenge and encouragement today. So one of the reasons we were sort of, the teaching team was feeling sort of out of their depth when Mike asked if we were excited, is that we've been through some things with our kids. You know, we've made it through the disciplining years of ages 0 to 5. We've made it through middle school. We've done training, right? All of us have kids high school aged or older, high school or adult children. We're trying to learn now how to move into the coaching and the consulting phases. And these phases, regardless of who you are, if you're a parent, if you're a grandparent, if you're a coach, if you're an aunt or an uncle, there's something that you might glean from this. And if you're a kid, you might say, I want to learn some things that I can use with my parents. Because my kid, the younger one, sat in the message in Hopkinton and just burst out laughing and nodded and shook his head through the entire thing. So I know he came out with some opinions. You might have some as well. So why do we set expectations for our children? Isn't that just putting undue pressure on our kids? You see, when our kids are young, we set expectations to keep them safe, establish a foundation for their lives, and teach them how we expect them to navigate the world. Christian parents set expectations that help our children begin to establish their own faiths. See, when our kids are really little, this is easier to do because we have so much control over what happens in our homes. We get to set bedtimes, and we decide what we eat, and we decide what entertainment comes into the house. We know what the routines are. We've established those routines. We get to be the primary influence over our children as they begin to grow. And it's in those early years that we set expectations based on for their behavior that we hope become embedded character qualities that really start to set them up to establish their own faith in God. In the early years, we don't know who they're going to be. I used to look at my oldest little face when he was just an infant and think, who are you going to be? And I would look at moms who had like teenagers who were starting to get glimpses of who their kids were going to be, and I was sort of jealous. Like, you already know who your kid's going to be. I have no idea. He's a blob. I have no idea what he's going to be. But what I did know was that I could start teaching him things that would start embedding character qualities into his life. We can teach our kids to be kind, helpful, and respectful, even if we don't know who they're ultimately going to be. We can teach them to apologize and to extend grace to people. When we set these expectations in our young children, we're teaching them how we expect them to engage with the world. And as Christians, we root those expectations in teaching from God's word because we want them to learn to live in verses like Colossians 3:12 through 14. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you, and over all these virtues put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. Or we want them to learn and to live in verses like Galatians 5:22-23. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. I didn't need to know what my children's interests were. I didn't need to know what their talents were going to be to start grounding them in God's word and setting expectations for them that would mold their characters. As they grow, we pray that this kind of teaching pierces their hearts and moves from expected behavior to embedded character qualities and ultimately to lives deeply rooted in the kind of godly wisdom and understanding which will set them up for life. When we take this job seriously, we're setting them up for success. They have to listen to us, but before they can listen, we have to teach. Our teaching is a gift. Proverbs 1 says, "Listen, my son, to your father's instruction, and do not forsake your mother's teaching. They are a garland to grace your head and a chain to adorn your neck." And further in Proverbs 2, these are excerpts. "My son, if you accept my words and store up my commands within you, turning your ear to wisdom and applying your heart to understanding, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. Then you will understand what is right and just and fair, every good path. For wisdom will enter your heart, and knowledge will be pleasant to your soul. Discretion will protect you, and understanding will guard you." When we set expectations for the kinds of behavior that lead to embedded godly character qualities, we are building a foundation of wisdom and understanding in our lives that ultimately grace our children's heads as garlands for their heads and a necklace around their necks. Those gifts go with them everywhere. Sometimes we don't see it, but those gifts go with them everywhere. It starts when they are young. The problem is that our children don't stay sheltered in our homes forever. As they grow, the balance of influence shifts, slowly at first, but then more quickly as they grow and friends enter their lives and they go out into the world, and the balance between how we influence them in the home and who's influencing them out in the world shifts. Now, some days that shift feels manageable. And other days, that shift feels cataclysmic. And I don't know how you react when you're sort of feeling that cataclysmic shift, but my reaction is often, if not always, to tighten my grip. I tighten my grip, I hold fast to my expectations, I may even raise them. Tension grows as our kids' worlds open up and influences outside the house, just as they're starting to get really good at saying no and fantastic at walking away. But even as the world opens up to influences that are coming into their lives, new opportunities are also presenting themselves. And those opportunities can change the nature of our expectations for our kids. Maybe we start adding to the expectations. When they were little, it was be kind and helpful and respectful. But maybe as they enter the teen years, it also becomes and be a football star and a straight-A student and a virtuoso violinist. How about we add those? But really, the most important thing is to be kind and helpful and respectful. But please, if you could also be a football star and a straight-A student and a virtuoso, you know what? Be all of them. Somewhere along the line, godly character expectations we set for our children can bleed into worldly expectations. And we can get caught up in our own hopes and dreams for our kids that out-prioritize the godly character expectations we originally started to establish in them. And we may say that we don't, but our actions might speak differently. Those added expectations may be tied to hopes and dreams for our children that they don't share, or maybe rooted in our own ambitions, or maybe in our own regrets and insecurities, or maybe in a pride that shows itself in a way that pride has never shown itself in us before. Not the kind of pride that is, I'm so excited to celebrate your achievements in something that brings life to you. But maybe the pride that says something like, what you accomplish is a direct reflection on me. Don't disappoint me. Don't embarrass me. Oh, you say that sounds extreme. Parents aren't really like that. Have you been on the sideline of an 8-year-old basketball game when the basketball coach, who's also a poor kid's father, is purple because his 8-year-old made a bad pass? Or have you heard a baseball coach say to a kid, I'm not letting you pitch because I want to win the game? I've heard that. And it's not just sports. It's really any endeavor that a parent or adult places their own ambitions, hopes, and dreams on a kid that makes it more about them and less about what's best for the kid. So a key to keeping our expectations healthy and fair is constantly evaluating and adjusting them. And I don't mean being wishy-washy. I mean being thoughtful, prayerful, and flexible with them. We can be consistent and flexible. We can be consistent and make expectations. And we can start evaluating our expectations in light of our children's behavior. So let's take a look at Ephesians 6:4. I looked at 3 different translations and amplified them with a little help from the dictionary because I just thought that the definitions were so good. Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord, from the NIV. Also, we could look at it like, fathers, do not intensely irritate and frustrate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. Or from the NASB, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Fathers, do not deliberately annoy your children and try to make them behave aggressively, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. But my favorite, which didn't need any help from the dictionary, was from the Message. Fathers, don't frustrate your children with no-win scenarios. Take them by the hand and lead them in the way of the master. That verse made me think of 2 quotes that I've run across in the past 6 months. One is from Dr. Catherine Purvis, a child development researcher, who says, behavior is the language of children who have lost their voice. And another from a woman that I heard at a writer's retreat recently, having unrealistic expectations of kids is one of the biggest barriers to a child's healing and our ability to connect with them. Don't expect them to do something they are simply incapable of doing. When a child loses his or her voice or is asked to do something they simply are incapable of doing, that feeling of frustration and helplessness is likely to come out in their behavior. Every kid is different. You can parent two kids in the same way, in the same household, with two very different outcomes. My kids are like chalk and cheese. Parenting one is not the same as parenting the other. Just saying. We'll get to that later. Flexibility allows you to parent each child according to the way that that child is wired. Flexing is not weakness. It's actually strength. I had somebody say to me once, I can't make an exception to my rule because that's weak parenting. And I said to her, if you can't make an exception to your rule, that's weak parenting. If you're so afraid that you're setting a new precedent by making one exception to your rule, think about that. My kids always knew what the rules were. They knew when I was making an exception, and they knew the next time we were probably going back to the rule. It's one thing that went well. There's lots of stuff we're getting to that didn't. So in light of the above, what can you do? I would say first, align your expectations with who God created your child to be. I don't know if anybody here has ever seen this illustration before. Maybe you have. I've used it twice already, but it just keeps applying, so I'm using it again. See, one Christmas, I came up with the brilliant idea when my kids were young of a craft to do to kill time on like a snowy day. I decided that I was going to cut out 4-foot-tall Christmas trees, and we were going to paint them as Christmas trees. So the plan was it's going to look like a Christmas tree. And then we're going to put them on their bedroom doors and decorate them. Now, some of you know my kids. If you know my kids, I'm guessing I don't have to tell you which one painted which tree. Okay, the one on the left was painted by my oldest, Cameron. He's the one who just landed in Atlanta because he goes to Georgia Tech, because he's an engineer, because he likes to know how the world works, and everything he does is in alignment with how he expects the world to work. So he's only going to paint a Christmas tree green, and if I didn't know who had painted those Christmas trees, I would tell you Cameron painted the green Christmas tree. When I look at that, I see him, and I love it. Jax, my 18-year-old, painted the one on the right. He lives outside the box 24/7. He's never going to paint a Christmas tree green if there is a box of paint that includes every other color in the rainbow. When I look at that tree, I know he painted that one, and I love it because it tells me who he is. Psalm 139, 13-14 says, "For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well." The God who created the spring flowers may have made your child an artist. And the God who created the world by building it with cells and molecules and atoms may have made your child a scientist. And the God who set the universe into motion using physics may have made your child an engineer. For every aspect of who God is, he has put his hand stamp on each one of us in a unique way. And so however he has created your child, however he has put his own glory into your child, why would we expect our children to live up to any other expectation? In fact, when we don't raise them in alignment with who God created them to be, we run the risk of causing our children to wilt. When they are raised according to how God created them, they flourish. And otherwise, they might begin to wilt. Where in your parenting might you be falling prey to this one? And I think this one is sneaky because I think there's a lot of unspoken expectations in families. You see, my family is a family of engineers. There's a lot of math going on in my family. And so for the kids who don't want to be engineers, even if nobody tells them to be, they feel that pressure. And I'll tell you how they feel it. Like, it comes from the top, like a couple generations up. So how are you doing in math? What's your science grade? You can be whatever you want, but how are you doing in math? We're not telling them they have to be engineers. Tell me you have to be an engineer without telling them they have to be an engineer. Now, my niece was the first one of a creative bent to kind of buck the system. She's a model. If you've been to Target lately, you may have seen her on the wall. Last year, she was on the front of the Ulta Beauty thing in Northborough. I mean, she's doing it. And this past spring, she actually helped style somebody who was going to the Oscars, okay? So she's doing it. She's following her dreams and she's making them happen. She's on a remarkable path, but if you talk to her, she will still feel like she's not towing the family line. And I just think that's crazy. But I also get it because I live in that family. Sorry. We don't have to state our expectations to pass them on to our children. What is your child's behavior telling you? Is your child fighting to be seen or heard? Is your child wilting under the pressure to conform to their idea of your expectations? And if your response is, but I know, but if I let my child follow their dreams, they might starve. And I'm like, I feel you on this one, because I've got an artsy child. And I have learned, I go back to the graphic we've been using for this series, I just have to up my coaching game. Help him figure out how to follow a path that speaks to who he is, but also making sure he's got some marketable skills around him, and he feels supported. Next, identify where your expectations for your children reflect your own interests, ambitions, insecurities, or regrets. And the key to this one is be honest. So I went to a Central District Music Festival one year. This is where, if your kid's not into music, kids that do chorus or band or orchestra, they audition for the Massachusetts District Band or Orchestra, and then they go do a big concert with other like-minded kids. So I was sitting next to a father I didn't know. His kid goes to a different school, and he just started chatting, and he said to me, his son was in the orchestra as a violinist. And he said, this is just crazy for me. He said, I'm a soccer player. I love soccer. And he said, and my older son, loves soccer. So they do soccer together. They're all into the soccer world. And he said that my younger son, who plays the violin, came to me last year and said, Dad, I want to join or audition for the Worcester Youth Symphony Orchestra. And the dad was like, come again? So the dad says, well, we live in Sudbury. So that means that once a week, you're asking me to drive you from Sudbury to Worcester so you can rehearse with the orchestra. I don't think we can make that happen. So the kid said to his dad, so you're willing to drive all over the eastern seaboard for my brother's club soccer, but you can't take me to Worcester once a week? And the dad was like, huh. He said, Dad, that orchestra is my club soccer. He spoke his dad's language. His dad was kind of gobsmacked, and they made it work. And that dad, we were sitting at the district concert. This was not the Worcester Youth Orchestra, but it's all, We sat there, and the orchestra started to play, and he just sobbed. He was so proud of this son. And I was so proud of this kid for standing up to his dad and saying, Dad, you love soccer. Your ambitions are for soccer, but that's not me. Where are your ambitions and your interests driving your expectations for your kids? It could be regret or insecurities. I had things that I regretted not doing in high school that I wanted my kids to do. Now, I didn't want them to have regrets, which I thought, well, that's healthy. I don't want them to live in regrets. Well, I also wanted to live vicariously through them as they did things that I hadn't done. So that was dysfunctional. So what is driving how you're setting your expectations for your kids? And then prioritize your parent-child relationships. Understand that your child's compliance or lack of compliance with your expectations may not be a good barometer for the health of your relationships with your kids. You see, God has high expectations for us, but he leads us to follow his will within the context of loving relationship. He does not just leave us to struggle on our own. I'm going to read 2 verses that did not make it into the slide deck, but they just speak to God's relationship with us, how he loves us through relationship. One is John 10:14, I am the good shepherd, I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. Or John 14:26-27, but the advocate, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, will teach you all things and will remind you of everything I have said to you. Peace I leave you, my peace I give you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid. These verses, and so many others, these are just 2 that I picked, speak to how God guides us and leads us within the context of a loving relationship. So when we're trying to live the Christian life, he is right there alongside us, offering his love and his support. Christians that try to live the Christian life, Christians that try to rise up to the high standards and lofty goals of the Christian faith without leaning into their relationship with God or the power of the Holy Spirit through Jesus Christ, those who try to do all that without relationship, they burn out. They crash. They may walk away entirely. And it's not that different with our kids. If we hold a high standard and the relationship is not there. So I have 2 completely different boys. When they were younger, one always did what he was asked without arguing. Oh, just a side note, I was given permission to share all stories as long as I'm the one who comes out looking bad. And I was like, check, I can do that. Okay. One always did whatever he was asked without arguing. Whatever the expectations were, he rose up to meet them. The other one gave us constant pushback. So which one do you think was easier to parent? The compliant one. And which one do you think my friends loved watching me parent? The willful one. When you have a compliant child, it's really easy to think, this is pretty easy, and I'm pretty good at this. And when you have a willful child, it's pretty easy to think, what am I doing wrong? Which makes it really interesting to have 2 of them, one of each. And with the compliant child, it's easy to think, I think our relationship is on autopilot because everything's just going great. I ask him to do things, he does it. This is fantastic. Whereas the other one, we did battle with him daily, like 24/7. So compliant children absorb our expectations as if they're breathing them in and forgetting to exhale. As the years pass and the expectations increase, the internal pressure grows, and a compliant child's heart, mind, and soul may start feeling like this. With my compliant child, I kept blowing air into the balloon, but as long as the balloon remained intact, it was easy to think everything's okay. But in the spring of his senior year, I had an encounter with him that I consider, he may have others, that's okay. But I had an encounter with him the spring of his senior year that I consider the lowest point in my parenting him. As he'd always done, he was shouldering the pressures of school with determination and grit. But the final stretch of his senior year, things were just piling on and coming to a head at the same time. He was on the robotics team. He was on all sorts of other teams, but that particular team, it was like a part-time job, and the weekends were 3-day competitions, and then he had all of his AP classes, and it was just a wave crashing down on him. And he had a 3-day competition coming up, which meant he was literally gone from like 8 o'clock in the morning Friday and came home at 10 o'clock on Sunday. And he made a passing comment to me. He said, yeah, I have a physics test next week, and I have no idea when I'm going to study for it. And I thought I was being really good to be like, oh, that's okay. But in the back of my mind, I was like, what do you mean you're not going to study for your physics test? So about a week and a half goes by. We didn't talk about the physics test. And a friend of mine who goes to this church casually mentioned to me, she goes, so I hear from my daughter that the whole physics class bombed the test last week. And I was like, what? So I did some investigating. I had to get onto Canvas. And I saw what the stats were for the class, what's the average, what were the highs, what were the lows, what were the percentiles, where did he slot. And I sat him down in his room, and I looked at him, and I said, so I understand the whole class bombed the test last week. And he said, yeah, we did pretty bad. I said, I also see in Canvas that somebody got 100. And I said, and I don't care what the class did. If it was possible to get 100 on that test, I expect that would have been you. Now, as I'm speaking, you need to understand, I know I'm going down. Like, I see his face. He's looking straight through me. His blue eyes were just like ice. And I was like, Mayday, Mayday, pull up, eject. But it was like, the best way I can think of it, I couldn't stop. It was like the Russian commander on the hunt for Red October who had already realized he had just torpedoed his own submarine, and there was nothing he could do about it. The torpedo was already out of the hold. So I finished with this heartwarming phrase: I expect you to ace the next one. I'm just going to take a bow. He was my compliant child. He always absorbed my expectations. He took a breath, and through clenched teeth, he said, understood. I present you with the result. This is the state of my relationship with that kid circa June 2023. And it became very clear to me that when he left for college 2 months later and he flew to Atlanta, he didn't have to come back. That's what happens when your expectations completely destroy your relationship with your kids. Now, compare that to the trajectory I've been on with my more willful child. I put equal pressure on him, he would assure you, but that kid spent his entire life rejecting. He would not allow us to fill the balloon until it popped. He refused to keep absorbing the expectations until the internal pressure became too great. With him, it was like he lived his life with a built-in pressure valve. That kid's been letting off steam since birth. That made parenting him in the day-to-day much more challenging and, frankly, exhausting. Other people knew. I couldn't hide it. In fact, there was a time when my oldest was about 7, and he came to me and he said, Mom, I have no idea how to handle my brother, and I don't think you do either. And I was like, buddy, you are not wrong. But the constant challenge forced me to be always looking for better ways to connect with him. And he always kept the lines of communication open. We clear the air much more in the moment. I'm not saying he doesn't feel some internal pressure, but it is nowhere near the size of the balloon that my older son let it get. Do you have a child who works really hard to meet your expectations? Do you have one who's willing to push back? And have you thought about how your relationships, what those tendencies mean for your actual relationships with your kids? Where do you need to redouble your efforts to connect relationally with them? And so finally, address where you struggle to trust God. Address where parenting is revealing the weaknesses in your own faith, opportunities for growth in your own faith. You see, parenting has a way of forcing us to our knees. We don't get handed a baby and a handbook. I didn't get to turn to page 497 titled Senior Year, How to React When the Whole Class Bombs a Physics Test. But as I've processed and unpackaged what has gone well and what has gone sideways over the past 20 years, I've come to realize that parenting has shined a light on the dark corners of my own faith, places where I have needed to learn more to trust God. And for me, it was loosening my own grip and trusting God to take control and set the course for my kids. When I was finally forced to, and I was finally forced to because the older kid got on a plane and went to Atlanta and really didn't need to come back. And let me tell you, when we dropped him off, he was like, you don't need to call. If you call, I might answer. His actual words, I will not initiate, he said. I will not initiate. If you call, I might answer if it's convenient for me. That is the state that I had let things get to. I see some open jaws. Yes. But I've learned some things over this past year. When I was forced to let go of my grip, God showed up and showed me that he can blow our minds. First, he introduced me to the following passage and reminded me that he tends his flock like a shepherd. He gathers the lambs in his arms and carries them close to his heart. He gently leads those who have young. And I needed to spend the whole year just resting in this verse because I had blown it so badly. And to see that God would gently lead me with my young was all I could hold on to over the last year. Then he prompted me to apologize to my compliant child. I did it in the form of an email because it was a very long apology because there was a lot to cover. And I was so afraid to send it. And 20 minutes later, he wrote back with, "Thank you for your email," and a whole lot of grace. After that, God has put me through a release your grip and trust in me boot camp. And I wish I had 30 minutes to tell you just all the amazing things he did over the past year in me, in my son, and just in life. But I don't. But if you're struggling in this area, I would go to coffee with you because God has been amazing. Our Father really does tend his flock like a shepherd. He really does hold lambs, gather his lambs in his arms, and carries them close to his heart. He really does gently lead those who have young. I've also learned that when we humble ourselves before our children, we are modeling for them what it means for us to grow in our faith and showing them what it might look like for them to grow in theirs. The path to growth is messy and littered with mistakes, but God does great things when we stumble into his arms. And finally, our children can be grace givers when we give them the opportunity to be. When my son showed me grace, I saw a glimpse of the garland gracing his head and the chain adorning his neck that we worked so hard to give him, those gifts that we worked so hard to give him all those years ago. So in the last year, both of my kids have thanked me for holding them to high expectations. They liked that the standards were high. What they each told me was, that's not what you needed to apologize for, Mom. You needed to apologize for the how. It was how you did it. It was your inflexibility. It was not flexing when the situation required. And it was allowing our accomplishments to usurp our relationship. For them, it wasn't the what. It was the how. Maybe for you, it's the what. Maybe it's the how. Maybe it's a little of both. I don't know. But what I can tell you is that if you ask your kids, they'll let you know. So this morning at 7:51, I received a text from Cam. He was at the airport. He had made it through security. And he just texted Paul and me, and he said, "Thank you for a great visit home." 1 year ago, he couldn't have cared less about whether he ever came home. That's what God can do. That's what it means to have unrealistic expectations. It's what it means to learn how to flex and how to lean into relationship. And it's what it means to let God do his work, because he's amazing.